everyone. Namaste. Hope you guys are having a great week so far and an upcoming weekend on the way. I will continue to discuss KMT history with Tibet from Dr. Lin Xiaoting's book. Yeah, and I recently found out Squid Games actually happened, so that really made me feel kind of bizarre because I really thought it was all fiction. But yeah, as Tantra would suggest, nothing comes out of thin air. It is all energy exchange. So I don't know if I should watch season two. If any of you have watched season two, let me know so I can make my mind should I watch it now that I know it actually happened in the 80s and 90s to actual human beings? Okay, let's get into the KMT intelligence networks. People who live in Tibet probably already know this, but yeah. It is best to begin the story by tracing nationalist China's intelligence activities in Tibet. The war of resistance against Japan forced Chiang Kai-shek's regime to retreat from coastal China to the interior. The geographical proximity of southwest China and Tibet, along with the nationalist regime's relatively consolidated status in the southwest, provided Chiang Kai-shek with opportunities to initiate his intelligence networks within the Tibetan boundary for the first time since 1928. A wartime schedule in 1939 revealed that the nationalists were ready not only to enlarge existing pre-war intelligence units at the border areas of Kokonor, Alashan, Ordos, and Xikang, but were also prepared to install new stations in western Yunnan, Xinjiang, and Tibet. The expansion of the Chinese office in Lhasa as a result of the Wuzhongxing mission of 1940 further offered Chongqing a legitimate excuse to dispatch more staff to work in Tibet. By 1943, the two major intelligence units of the nationalist government, the Investigation and Statistics Bureau of the Military Affairs Commission and the Second Chamber of the Ministry of Military Ordnance, respectively established their positions in Tibet. According to one autobiographical source, nearly all of the Chinese staff holding important official positions in Lhasa, such as master of the Chinese school in Lhasa, director of the wireless station, and head of the meteorological station, were serving concurrently as secret Chinese agents. The KMT nationalists had two main objectives for their underground operations in Tibet. First, to construct a sound intelligence network throughout the whole of Tibet and recruit as many local inhabitants as possible to serve their regime. And second, enhance the nationalist government's links with pro-Han Chinese elements with a view to counteracting a Tibetan government that was out of China's effective control. Cultivating Tibetan pro-Han factions became more important when Radreng Rinpoche decided to resign after feeling uneasy due to his intuition from his practice. He saw a violent end to his life unless he resigned. And then there was an interregnum in his power regime, which led to the rise of Taktra Rinpoche's faction. He was perceived as being unfriendly to KMT, and he started appointing people who were not part of Radreng Hutuktu's faction, such as Mr. Surkang Zasa, as well as this famous person Shakapa, who wrote history books later on in his life. So they replaced the Radreng Hutuktu faction, yet the Lhasa people all thought that Taktra Rinpoche would resign if Radreng Rinpoche asked him to. As a result, the relations between the nationalist government were strained during Taktra's reign. Local animosity increased due to the establishment of some of Lhasa's political institutions like the Foreign Affairs Bureau. In 1943, in response to the new political situation in Tibet, Chiang Kai-shek personally ordered support for Rabka's Tibetan Revolutionary Party. And there was an all-out collaboration with Rabka and his group in Tibet and North India by integrating disparate and sporadic units that were against Tibetan authorities. The nationalist government was seeking to inflict more political pressure on an increasingly unfriendly regime in Lhasa dominated by Taktra Rinpoche. Apart from giving confidential support to Rapkha and his clique, China's national security planners considered other means of supporting pro-Han Chinese elements in Tibet. For instance, during his tenure as the Chinese representative in Lhasa, Shen Zonglian fostered relations with Surkang Dzasa, then head of the Tibetan Foreign Affairs Bureau, predicting that Surkang and his son, Surkang Wangchen would sooner or later become the most authoritative figures in the Tibetan political arena. Shen endeavored to maneuver a reorganization of the Tibetan cabinet in the early half of 1946, with Surkang as the second to Taktra regent's officials. Shen Zonglian also took pains to develop a closer connection with family members of His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, such as his father, the Yapshi Kung, and his older brother, Gyalo Tontrup. In early 1946, Shen successfully persuaded the Yapshi Kung to let Gyalo Tontrup study in China proper. Shortly afterwards, Shen further managed a covert trip for Gyalo Tontrup and Phuntsuk Jashi, the Dalai Lama's brother-in-law, to China. When the news eventually reached Lhasa of the arrival of the Dalai Lama's family in Nanking, both the Taktra administration and the British were extremely shocked and were alerted to Shen's activity in Lhasa. Despite efforts made by the capable Shen Zonglian to woo important Tibetan figures over to the Chinese side, most high nationalist officials set their hopes on the ex-regent Radreng Hutuktu, whose political weight in Tibet could not be overlooked during the closing years of the Second World War. When the 6th KMT National Conference was in session, using the name of the party leader, not the head of the state of the Chinese Republic, Chiang Kai-shek personally invited Radreng to visit Chongqing and to participate in the forthcoming event. When it became clear that the former Tibetan regent was unable to arrange his trip due to delicate political relations between Chongqing and Lhasa, Chiang Kai-shek still hoped that he might be able to send a personal envoy to China's wartime capital. When even this option proved to be impractical, Chiang Kai-shek decided to appoint Radreng as a member of the KMT Central Executive Committee, an appointment that no doubt bore considerable political symbolism. Obviously, the nationalist planners were generally convinced that Radreng would return to power, but this proved to be wrong. The conflict. The new Tibetan regent created by the Radreng Hutuktu somewhat unexpectedly distanced himself from his predecessor and showed no favoritism towards Radreng's supporters from the beginning. When there was a vacancy for a ministerial position in the Kashak, Taktra appointed Wangchen Gelek, who was hostile to Radreng's clique, to this position. With these appointments came a major shift of personnel in the upper levels of the Tibetan government, with anti-Radreng officials replacing those who were pro-Radreng. Despite signals of Taktra's negative attitude, Radreng was determined to return to Lhasa to restore his regency. His followers also more than once told the British in Lhasa that the ex-regent had hopes of resuming office. In 1944, his entourage and himself arrived in Lhasa with great pomp and ceremony. The critical face-to-face meeting with Taktra at the Potala Palace in early January 1945 was not a pleasant one for the ex-regent. Translated versions of Tibetan accounts suggest that Radreng first told Taktra that the danger to his life had passed. He then went on to say that Taktra was too old and thus it must be very difficult for him to continue the responsibility of the regency, and this was the reason that he had returned to Lhasa. However, instead of agreeing to abdicate from his regentship, as had allegedly been agreed between the two in 1941, Taktra gave no answer, nor did he make any arrangements to hold further conversations with Radreng. Furious, disheartened, and humiliated by Taktra's cold and disdain, Radreng returned to his monastery soon after. The Radreng-Taktra relationship deteriorated further as Taktra's regime collided with the Radreng-affiliated Sera Monastery over a murder dispute. Toward the end of 1944, a group of Sera monks went to Lhundup, Dzong, a district north of Lhasa, to collect grain taxes. Unable to pay the required taxes, a group of Lhundup local peasants went to the district commissioner for assistance. This commissioner, who was a supporter of Taktra, later ordered the arriving Sera monks not to collect grain taxes without Lhasa's further instruction. One of the tax-collecting monks then went back to Sera Monastery to inform the abbot Ngawang about the event. The abbot, a close associate of Radreng, instructed his disciples to use any means, including bribery, to seek the cooperation of the Lhasa-appointed commissioner. Nevertheless, the district commissioner remained unmoved, and eventually the furious Sera monks beat him unconscious, resulting in his death a couple of days later. In 1945 January, fearing that the Lhasa authorities would seize their delegates and demand the arrest of the guilty monks, the Sera Monastery refused to participate in the approaching New Year's prayer festival in Lhasa. Yet it became evident that the Tibetan government would not tolerate such a boycott, particularly given that this would constitute an affront to the young Dalai Lama who was to attend this ceremony for the first time. The Kashak informed the Sera Monastery, that if the monks attended all the annual activities as usual, no monks would be arrested during the festival and the dispute would be settled later in April. Believing that they had won the dispute and that their monks would not be punished for the controversy over the grain collecting, important personages of the Sera Monastery joined the prayers in February 1945. The Lhasa government actually had no intention of settling the murder case in favor of the pro-Radreng monks. Instead, Taktra sought to take this opportunity to exercise his authority over the defiant Sera monastic authorities. In early June 1945, Lhasa suddenly ordered the dismissal of Sera Abbot Ngawang and other heads of the monastery. After an internal meeting, Ngawang and his entourage fled to Kham, or possibly even to China, before Taktra arrested them for disobedience and their part in the murder case. When Lhasa realized that the Sera abbot had fled, it immediately dispatched a group of soldiers to bring him back. Masquerading as an ordinary pilgrim, Ngawang successfully escaped capture and fled to Chinese-controlled Shigang. He then traveled via Kansa and Derge to Chongqing, where in 1946 he was received warmly by KMT officials. However, his entourage, including two of his brothers, was arrested and the members killed en route. So there's a footnote explaining that they tried to find a monastery to take refuge. However, they were refused entry, and then some of them sought help from Ma Bufang, a Kokonor Muslim warlord, and General Ma turned them in. That was such a dramatic twist. The Tibetan government's reaction to this was to imprison all Sera monks, including those involved in the Lhundup Dzong incident, exiling them to remote districts in North and West Tibet. Furthermore, all munitions possessed by the Sera Monastery for self-defense were confiscated. Taktra later appointed one of his closest allies as the new Sera Abbot. The Lhundup Dzong event was the starting point of the 2-year conflict that eventually culminated in the coup of 1947. The coup in Lhasa and the Sera Monastery rebellion. Around the time when the first post-war Chinese National Assembly was about to convene, the political situation in Tibet entered a much more strained stage. The Radreng group seemed to pose a genuine threat to the position of Taktra Rinpoche, who took every opportunity to rid the government of Radreng supporters. In December 1946, the only Radreng sympathizer with ministerial status was dismissed. As a result, toward the end of 1946, all 4 Tibetan ministers of the Kashak, Surkan Wangchen Gelek, Shekapa, Kapshopa, and the newly appointed Lalu, were either strongly anti-Radreng or had switched political allegiance to Taktra. On the other hand, after the Lhundup Dzong incident, Radreng's supporters affiliated with monastic sections in Lhasa repeatedly urged Radreng to take action against Taktra's purge. Personal memoirs reveal that Radreng's followers began to plan to assassinate the regent in late 1946, when Taktra was expected to travel to his hermitage from Lhasa. Yet the plotters were unable to organize in time, and Radreng's supporters decided to strike with hand grenades when Taktra was in attendance at a traditional festival in Lhasa in early 1947. Presumably alerted to the possibility of an attempt on his life, Taktra did not attend the festival. Unable to find a better occasion to assassinate Taktra, Radreng's followers decided to kill the regent with a parcel bomb. On receiving the news of the explosion, Taktra and his top advisors took no immediate action. However, a few weeks later, on April 14, 1947, Taktra suddenly instructed the arrest of Radreng. On the same morning, the Tibetan cabinet received an ultra-secret telegram from the Tibetan representative in Nanking, in which it was revealed that the ex-regent had just sent an urgent message to the nationalist authorities through his envoys requesting Chinese troops, ammunition, and airplanes to help him overthrow Taktra. The telegram also indicated that Radreng's message apparently offered to accept China's sovereignty over Tibet. This urgent telegram further revealed that Chiang Kai-shek had agreed to respond to Radreng's request within 5 days. The political status of Tibet was now being threatened. After a lengthy discussion, Taktra instructed his officials to bring Radreng to Lhasa under arrest. 2 Kashak ministers, along with the Tibetan commander-in-chief and about 200 troops, soon left for Radreng's monastery. Unprepared for Taktra's immediate action, Radreng's hermitage was unable to take defensive action. As a result, the ex-regent and his close associates were all escorted to Lhasa without much resistance. When the Sera monks learned that the government had sent troops to arrest Radreng, they became furious. Their anger was not only directed toward Taktra and his regime, but also at their own abbot appointed by Taktra. On April 16th, a large group of angry and militant Sera monks started a rebellion. They first killed their abbot and headed to Lhasa in order to rescue Radreng. The next day, Lhasa came to a standstill. Shops and schools were closed, and Tibetan troops were reinforced to protect government offices and temples. On 20th April, unable to tolerate the Sera monks' behavior, the Kashak gave an order to suppress the rebellion. A civil war thus broke out between Taktra's regime and the Radreng-backed Sera monastery. In Nanking, a considerable shift of attitude toward Taktra's government began to emerge in the spring of 1947. General Chen Cheng, then Chief of General Staff, was the first to call for a change of policy publicly. In March 1947, he asserted that the present Tibetan government was not seeking a further political integration with China, but was in fact promoting a separatist movement. He claimed that Lhasa's real intention had been sufficiently revealed in the communiqué presented by the first official mission dispatched by Taktra, and moreover, Lhasa was now prepared to send another official mission to India to join the Asian Relations Conference with its own national flag. Chen therefore openly suggested that it was time for Nanking to support Radreng and to restore his regency. Several weeks later, as civil war broke out in Lhasa, more and more top advisors and senior officials within the nationalist government were convinced that the time was opportune for Nanking to resolve the long-lasting Tibetan questions. Advisors from Chiang Kai-shek's Office of Aids urged Chiang to order the mobilization of Ma Bufang and Liu Enhui's troops toward the Sino-Tibetan border. They meanwhile suggested that the Waijiaobu contact Nehru of India and explain all the circumstances to him in order to prevent any possible British intervention. In the meantime, the 2 biggest nationalist intelligence sections, the Investigation and Statistics Bureau and the Second Chamber of the Ministry of National Defense, also preferred an immediate and unyielding stance toward the existing Tibetan authorities. Secret agents in Lhasa had repeatedly prompted Nanking to take drastic measures to back the coup. They greatly feared that if Radreng eventually failed, Taktra's next step would be to declare Tibetan independence, and his next targets would be those KMT intelligence agents who had long been in close touch with Radreng's group. If so, the national security planners in Nanking thought this would be the end of the entire Chinese underground operation in Tibet. If traditional pro-Han Chinese factions were to be crushed by Taktra, nationalist efforts in Tibet, which had been assiduously developed since the Second World War, would be totally wasted, and Chinese officials dispatched to Lhasa would no longer have a foothold there. These concerns later proved to be correct. Nanking's inclination to use military means to intervene in the Sera Monastery incident was comprehensible. Diplomatically, by the time of the Tibetan coup, the British were about to leave India and would have been unlikely to back Tatra's regime financially or militarily. Politically, Radreng was a member of the KMT CEC, and even his honorific Buddhist title was conferred by the nationalist government. It would have been greatly damaging to the KMT's prestige in Tibet, but also in other peripheral regions of China, if a person such as Radreng were indeed killed. In terms of national security, furthermore, Chiang Kai-shek and his staff were obliged to do something. Many thought that the movement of Chinese troops in Yunnan, Xikang, and Kokonor toward the border would be enough to frighten the obstinate Tibetans. On 26 April, a very detailed military démarche and a circumstantially drawn military map were prepared by the Ministry of National Defense and awaited the approval of Chiang Kai-shek. In this scheme, Chiang's military strategist proposed ordering 2 divisions of KMT-controlled cavalry stationed in Gansu to move towards South Kokonor, while Liu Wenhui's force, along with the local Khan militias, moved west and occupied Lhasa-controlled territories west of the upper Yangtze River. In addition, these top advisors urged Chiang Kai-shek to seek a proper official with a military background to take up the position of Chinese representative in Lhasa in order to control the aftermath of the military operation. However, the nationalist policy of associating with Taktra's regime and endeavoring to persuade the existing Lhasa authorities to join China's post-war political framework had prevented Nanking from preparing for a war with Tibet. As General Bai Chongxi, then Minister of National Defense, later put it in a memorandum, from Nanking's perspective, winning a war against Taktra's regime surely would be favorable to post-war China's frontier designs. Yet, if the Chinese should lose, the price the Chinese had to pay would probably be the permanent loss of Tibet from China's territory. He thus questioned whether the central government should take such a political and military gamble in order to control this remote territory. Even if Chiang Kai-shek were willing to become actively involved in the Tibetan Civil War, little time was reserved for him. Nanking first sent orders to the Tibetan government to stop the fighting and asked for the protection of the lives of the ex-regent and Sera monks in light of the Buddhist teaching. Yet these telegrams were ineffectual. On 2nd May, lacking both provisions and ammunition, the Sera monastery surrendered. 6 days later, Radreng suddenly died in prison without warning. In a telegram dated 13th May from the Tibetan government to Chiang Kai-shek, the Kashak simply informed Nanking that the ex-regent died naturally and that his death was greatly lamented by Tibetan officials. It also reported that the Tibetan authorities had restored peace and order in Lhasa, tactfully diminishing the need for any possible intervention by the Chinese. Chiang Kai-shek regarded the dispatch of the Kashak's report of Radreng's death to him as evidence of both the government's subordinate status to Nanking and its willingness to continue interacting with the Chinese. Moreover, Chiang, now well aware that there was no hope for the pro-Han faction to regain power, personally instructed his officials that no military plan needed to be drawn up vis-a-vis the Sera Monastery incident. Without the confidence and preparedness to get involved in the chaotic situation in Tibet, Nanking could only watch Taktra's regime gradually pacify the rebellion and take over Radreng's monastic footholds one after another. On 17th May, when the Tibetan troops eventually captured Radreng Monastery, the last stronghold of Radreng's faction, the civil war came to an end.